The Tang Dynasty, once a golden empire, was tearing itself apart. A massive rebellion swept across northern China, leaving chaos in its wake. Amidst the turmoil, one city stood as the final barrier between the rebels and total victory: Suiyang. Think of Suiyang as the last locked gate on a vital highway. This highway, the Grand Canal, connected the rebellious north to the wealthy, vulnerable south. The south was the empire's heartland and breadbasket. If Suiyang fell, the rebels would flood south, cutting off the dynasty's money and food, ensuring its collapse. Guarding this gate were two men: Zhang Xun, a brilliant and determined commander, and Suiyang, the wise governor who supported him. Together, they prepared their small garrison for what was coming. A vast rebel army, over 100,000 strong, marching toward their walls. The empire's fate depended on this last stand. The first sight of the rebel army stole the breath from every defender on Suiyang's walls. A dark tide of soldiers and steel flowed across the northern plains, so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon. The morning sun glinted off countless spears and helmets, creating a shimmering sea of death that advanced with relentless purpose. From the walls, the defenders could hear the distant thunder of marching feet, the clatter of armor, and the occasional blast of war horns. It was a symphony of impending violence. Commander Zhang Xun stood motionless on the battlements, his face a mask of grim calculation. He estimated their numbers at well over 100,000. Against them, he had fewer than 7,000 men, mostly local militia, volunteers, and a handful of seasoned soldiers. The mathematics of war declared Suiyang already lost. Yet his eyes showed no surrender, only resolve. Governor Suiyang joined him, his usually composed features pale. He observed quietly that the rebels meant to overwhelm them quickly. Zhang Xun simply nodded, his eyes never leaving the approaching army. Already, he was assessing the rebel formation, the placement of siege towers, the clusters of archers, the cavalry units waiting like storm clouds on the flanks. Every detail mattered. By noon, the rebel host had completely encircled the city. The thunder of war drums echoed across the plains, answered by the nervous shifting of defenders on the walls. The rebel general, Yin Ziqi, made no immediate demands for surrender. His confidence required no negotiation. Instead, his engineers began assembling massive siege engines, towers that stood taller than the walls, catapults capable of hurling stones that could shatter gatehouses. The defenders watched in dread, their hands tightening around spears and bows. The first assault came at dusk. Wave after wave of rebels charged forward, their battle cries rising like a storm. Siege ladders slammed against stone walls as arrows darkened the sky. Zhang Xun moved calmly along the battlements, directing his men with precise gestures. They poured boiling oil down on the attackers, followed by burning arrows that ignited the slippery substance. Screams filled the air as men became living torches. Yet the rebels kept coming. They were professionals, seasoned, ruthless, and numerous. For every ladder pushed away, two more took its place. For every volley of arrows loosed by the defenders, three answered from below. The battle wore on as the sun sank, staining the western sky the color of blood. When the rebels finally retreated after 2 hours, they left hundreds of dead beneath the walls. The defenders had held, but at a cost. The cobblestones ran red with blood, both enemy and their own. As medics tended to the wounded, Zhang Xun and Suiyang surveyed the damage. The real siege, they knew, had only just begun. Food, water, arrows, morale, everything would now be measured, rationed, and fought for. And beyond the walls, the rebels were only growing stronger. Weeks bled into months, each sunrise revealing the same grim tableau. the ever-present rebel hosts surrounding Suiyang like vultures circling a dying animal. The initial fervor of defense had long since evaporated, replaced by the grinding, soul-crushing reality of the siege. The air, once fresh, now carried the perpetual stench of unwashed bodies, smoke, and the faint, sweet odor of decay from beyond the walls. The first and most relentless enemy was hunger. The carefully measured grain stores, which Governor Suiyang had rationed with meticulous precision, dwindled to nothing. The defenders' daily meal shrank from a bowl of thick gruel to a watery soup, where a few grains of rice were a rare treasure. Then, the soup stopped. They slaughtered the cavalry horses first. The men ate the tough, stringy meat in solemn silence, each knowing it was a temporary reprieve. When the horses were gone, they turned to the dogs, the cats, and finally the rats. Soldiers became experts at setting traps in the rubble, their worth measured by the number of rodents they could contribute to the communal pot. The broth they brewed was thin and greasy, but it was calories. It was life. Their bodies began to consume themselves. Cheekbones grew sharp and prominent, casting deep shadows on gaunt faces. Uniforms hung loose on frames where muscle had withered to bone. A simple climb up the stone steps to the battlements left men gasping for air, their hearts pounding violently against their ribs. The constant, gnawing emptiness in their stomachs was a pain that never ceased, a dull ache that overshadowed everything, even fear. Men grew listless, their movements slow and labored. The vibrant energy of the garrison faded into a hollow-eyed lethargy. Amidst this physical decay, Commander Zhang Xun's brilliant mind remained their sharpest weapon. His most famous stroke of genius came on a moonless night. Dozens of shadowy figures were lowered over the walls on ropes, swaying silently in the dark. The rebel sentries, alert to any activity, raised the alarm. Convinced it was a night raid, their officers ordered a volley of arrows. Thousands of shafts whistled through the air, thudding into the silent forms. Only at dawn did the rebels discover their mistake. The raiders were merely straw dummies dressed in spare uniforms. Zhang Xun's men hauled them up, cheering weakly as they harvested a precious bounty of arrows from their straw-filled bodies. It was a magnificent trick, a moment of triumph that lifted their spirits, but it did nothing to fill their bellies. The suffering extended beyond the soldiers. The city's civilians, who had initially supported the defenders, now suffered alongside them. The same hunger that gripped the garrison stalked the streets. Parents gave their portions to children, who cried endlessly from the pain in their small stomachs. The old and the sick began to die first, quietly succumbing to starvation in their homes. There were no tears left to mourn them. Grief had become a luxury. The city fell into a profound silence, broken only by the moan of the wind and the distant taunting sounds of the well-fed rebel camp. The one hope, the single thread they all clung to, was the possibility of reinforcements. The fierce warrior Zhang Xun volunteered for the suicidal mission. One night, he and a band of the strongest remaining men staged a furious sally from a side gate, cutting a temporary path through the surprised rebel lines. Zhang Xun fought his way through, his heart burning with the desperate plea for help. Weeks later, he returned alone. His body was a map of new scars, and his left hand was missing its little finger. He had reached the camp of a Tang general, Lan Jinming, who had a large, fresh army. But the general, more concerned with protecting his own power than aiding the empire, had refused. He even offered Zhang Xun a place in his own army, trying to bribe him with food and wine. In a gesture of ultimate fury and despair, Zhang Xun had drawn his sword and severed his own finger, laying it before the stunned general as a bloody testament to his broken oath. He then turned his horse and rode back into hell to die with his brothers. His return and the news he brought extinguished the final flicker of hope in Suiyang. They had been abandoned. The empire had left them to die. It was at this moment of absolute despair that Commander Zhang Xun made the decision that would echo through history. To keep the army from collapsing, to give them the strength to lift their weapons for one more day, he made the ultimate sacrifice. He ordered the execution of his own concubine, a woman who had followed him faithfully. Her body was cooked and presented as food for the soldiers. Governor Suiyang followed suit, offering his household servants. The act was beyond horror, beyond comprehension. It was a descent into a moral abyss from which there could be no return. Men wept as they ate. They vomited it back up, then forced themselves to eat again, their souls screaming in protest even as their bodies desperately accepted the sustenance. The line between humanity and survival had been erased. They were no longer soldiers fighting for a dynasty. They were animals fighting for the next breath, their commander leading them deeper into the darkness to keep a sliver of light, the idea of their duty, alive. The seasons turned. The scorching summer sun beat down on emaciated bodies. Autumn winds brought a chill that cut through their thin clothing to the bone. They were living skeletons now, their skin stretched taut over sharp bone. Their eyes were vacant, sunken pools of suffering. Yet, when the rebel drums sounded for an assault, they still found the strength to stumble to the walls. They still lifted their spears. They still fought. Not for victory, not for glory, but because Zhang Xun still stood with them, a gaunt specter of defiance, and because they had already paid a price too terrible to be rendered meaningless by surrender. The 10th month arrived, bringing with it an unseasonable chill that seeped into the bones of the skeletal defenders. By October of 757, Suiyang was no longer a city but a tomb. Its streets were silent, populated only by ghosts and the dying. The once proud defenders were now barely recognizable as human. Their eyes, sunken deep into skull-like faces, held a vacant stare, yet a flicker of stubborn defiance remained. They were beyond hunger, beyond fatigue, existing in a state of pure, grim endurance. Their bodies had long since consumed all fat and muscle. They were living skeletons clad in rags, their movements slow and painful. The act of lifting a spear required a monumental effort that left them breathless and trembling. The final rebel assault began not with a frantic rush, but with a grim, methodical certainty. The rebels, well-fed and equipped with fresh siege engines, knew they were entering a city of the dead. They met little physical resistance. There were no boiling pots of oil left to pour, no arrows to loose, and scarcely the strength in the defenders' arms to swing a sword. The outer walls, crumbling from months of relentless attacks, were breached in multiple places. The few dozen remaining defenders, their numbers dwindled from thousands, did not break and run. Instead, they performed a slow, fighting retreat into the heart of the city, making the rebels pay for every step of rubble and every alleyway. They gathered for their last stand in the central square, before the main government hall. Perhaps 50 men remained, clustered around their leaders. Zhang Xun, so emaciated his uniform, hung like a shroud, could no longer stand without support. Suiyang, ever the administrator, leaned heavily on a broken spear as a staff. The fierce warrior Tang Dynasty, his body a network of old scars and fresh wounds, stood before them, a broken sword in his hand. His missing finger was a stark testament to their abandonment. When the rebel troops finally surrounded them, a strange silence fell. The rebels, these hardened and brutal soldiers, hesitated. They were not facing an enemy army but a gathering of walking corpses who refused to lie down and die. Their defiance was not loud or boastful. It was a quiet, terrifying absolute fact of their existence. General Yin Ziki, his left eye still covered from the wound Tang Dynasty had given him months before, pushed through his men. He looked upon the pathetic yet awe-inspiring group, with a mixture of contempt and profound respect. He could not understand such loyalty, such sacrifice. He offered them a clear choice: surrender and live, or die. The response was not a shouted refusal, but a series of quiet, unwavering declarations. Zhang Xun, his voice a dry rasp that barely carried, spoke of duty and honor. He stated that to surrender would be to invalidate every sacrifice made within those walls, to render the deaths of thousands meaningless. To die here, now, was the final and necessary act of their defense. Zhang, when pressured, let out a hoarse, cracking laugh that echoed terribly in the silent square. "I intended to die fighting the rebels," he stated. "If you offered me a chance to live, I would not accept it. I will not be a traitor to my country or my comrades." His words sealed their fate. One by one, the remaining defenders were cut down where they stood. They did not beg. They did not cry out. They met their ends with a quiet dignity that unnerved their executioners. Zhang Xun, Suiyang, Zhang, and the other core leaders were taken prisoner. Yin Ziqi, perhaps hoping to break their legendary spirit and make a spectacle of their submission, had them brought before him one last time. He repeated his offer of life in exchange for their allegiance to the rebel cause. Each man, in turn, refused. Their wills, forged in the unimaginable crucible of the past 10 months, were unbreakable. They had endured the unendurable. A mere threat of death was nothing. Seeing the futility of it all, Yin Ziqi gave the order. Zhang Xun, Suiyang, Zhang, and 33 other officers were executed. They died as they had lived for those 10 months, defiant. In the immediate aftermath, the rebels occupied a city of ghosts. The strategic victory was theirs, but the cost had been staggering. The 10-month siege had drained rebel resources, pinned down a massive army, and given the shattered Tang Dynasty something it desperately needed: time. The sacrifice of Suiyang became a rallying cry for the Tang forces. The story of the city that refused to fall, of the men who chose death over dishonor, spread like wildfire, igniting a renewed spirit of resistance across the empire. The Tang general Guo Ziyi, leading the imperial counteroffensive, used the time, bought with Suiyang's blood, to regroup and reorganize. Within months of the city's fall, the Tang army had recaptured the western capital, Chang'an, and then the eastern capital, Luoyang. The rebellion, which had seemed unstoppable, began to crumble, its momentum broken in no small part by the stubborn resistance of a single city. The Tang emperor posthumously honored the defenders. Zhang Xun and Suiyang were given titles of high nobility, and temples were erected in their memory. They were celebrated as the ultimate embodiments of loyalty and sacrifice. Yet, their story was never without controversy. The act of cannibalism, the sacrifice of the innocent to feed the army, cast a long and dark shadow. Even as they were honored as heroes, scholars and officials debated the morality of their choices. Were they paragons of virtue who saved the empire, or had they crossed a line that should never be crossed, even in war? This moral dilemma ensured that the story of Suiyang was not just one of simple heroism, but a complex and haunting tragedy that continues to be debated to this day. They became eternal symbols of both the heights of human courage and the terrible, dehumanizing cost of war. For 10 months, 6,800 starving defenders held a city against 130,000 professional soldiers. They fought over 400 battles. Their sacrifice, including the unthinkable decision to cannibalize the dead, bought the Tang Dynasty the precious time it needed to survive. While their methods remain one of history's most controversial moral questions, their patriotism and unimaginable sacrifice cannot be denied. They demonstrated that the human spirit, when tested to its absolute limit, can alter the course of history. If you found this story of ultimate sacrifice compelling, please like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most incredible events.